Okay, cool. So I just want to review the fundamentals of endocrinology. And as we have just talked about, we compared and contrasted neurotransmitters and hormones. And we said that neurotransmitters, okay, are the nervous system, and these are direct methods of communication, right? The nervous system is very much a micromanager in the sense that for something to be a neurotransmitter, it is secreted or released from the axon of a neuron directly onto receptors. Whereas a hormone is typically going to be released into the bloodstream, and then it will circulate to where it will act. So it is an indirect way of regulating body processes. You guys okay with that? Okay, cool. But here's the thing. And I want to start here because this really kind of cements the major concept of the endocrine system. The endocrine system is actually really just an extension of the nervous system. Is that everybody okay there so far?
Yeah.
And the fact that the central nervous system controls.
Yes, the central nervous system is in direct control, and in fact, the central nervous system makes up a very important part of the endocrine system. That that you could not divorce a part of the endocrine system from the nervous system. That is how related they are. And we're going to talk about that relationship because it is very close. And as you'll find out, it really is the nervous system calling all the shots when it comes to endocrinology. So endocrinology is simply an extension of the nervous system. So when we look at endocrinology, I think the best place to start is at the pituitary gland. And I believe the reading says this, but does the reading say that what is the master gland of the body, quote unquote? The pituitary gland? Guess what?
It's not.
It's not. Okay? So, where does a pituitary gland sit in the brain?
Just superior to the hypothalamus.
Just superior to the
Inferior, sorry.
inferior to the hypothalamus, right? So, imagine that this is the hypothalamus right up here, okay? And it just sits just inferior to the hypothalamus right here. And so just to orient you, you'd have the corpus callosum and then the cerebrum up here. This is going to be anterior, okay? This is going to be posterior here, or dorsal. Okay, you guys okay with that? All right, so ventral and caudal here. All right, and then inferior down here. Okay, so you've got your hypothalamus here, and as we talked about in neurology, hypothalamus is important for thermostat, right? Thermal regulation. We know that the thalamus that sits right above the hypothalamus is the relay station between the higher and lower brain. It relays. It's kind of like the gatekeeper of information coming in and going out of the brain from higher to lower. But here's the thing. So here's my pituitary gland, all right? And what do we notice? We notice the pituitary gland is divided into two lobes. There is the anterior portion of the pituitary gland, and we call that the anterior lobe or the anterior pituitary gland. And then there's this lobe here, posterior, and this is the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland or the posterior pituitary gland. You guys okay with that? So what I want you guys to notice right away is I have neuron bodies, and where are the bodies of these neurons? They are in the hypothalamus. And then the axons extend down where? Into the pituitary gland. So guess what? The posterior pituitary gland is a direct extension of the hypothalamus, of the central nervous system. It is the same tissue, right? The neurons Their axons end in the posterior pituitary gland. You guys see that there? And these axons release neurotransmitters, quote unquote, which are actually hormones, and they release their hormones into the capillary network of the posterior pituitary gland, and then those hormones leave and they go out into the central circulation. You guys okay with that? And the two major hormones that I want you guys to be aware of that come from the posterior pituitary gland, but really they come from the hypothalamus, right? Directly from the hypothalamus, right? So half of the pituitary gland is just another part of the hypothalamus. And those two hormones are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, or what we call ADH. You guys okay with that? Now, the major organs that oxytocin works on so it's circulated, it goes to the uterus and it goes to the breasts primarily, okay? And oxytocin is very good at causing smooth muscle in these structures to contract, okay? So where might that be important, or where will oxytocin be important as a hormone? Childbirth, right? Because after delivery of the child, what needs to happen? Your uterus needs to contract to control bleeding, right? To control hemorrhage, okay? And your breasts need to begin working so that baby can then begin to feed, right? And oxytocin works primarily in those two areas. Now, oxytocin is also a neurotransmitter found in the found in the CNS. And does anyone know what its role seems to be as a neurotransmitter? It seems to play a very important role in attachment and love. And we even find in childbirth, not only do we have lots of oxytocin being released as a hormone, we have lots of oxytocin being released in the CNS as a neurotransmitter. And that would make sense, right? Because you're delivering a baby and you want to bond, connect with that baby, and that makes sense from a survival standpoint, right? You want that bonding and attachment and that love. But oxytocin also is associated with more than just that, with just love in general, love and attachment in general. You guys okay with that? Mm-hmm. All right. The other hormone is something called antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. And is there another name for that? It's a medication, actually. Yeah, it's also known as vasopressin. Good. So what do you think, well, first of all, ADH acts upon the kidney here, and what do you think its action is?
To control water.
To control water balance. Specifically, what does it do, if you had to guess? Causes you to hold on to water. Yeah. It's antidiuretic, or against diuresis. Yeah. So it is a hormone involved in making us hold on to water, right? So when we get dehydrated, for example, or we start losing fluid, we would expect antidiuretic hormone to be released by the posterior pituitary gland, right? You guys okay with that? Makes sense? All right. Excellent. Now, the kidneys themselves are also an important endocrine organ, and they release a couple of hormones. One hormone in particular is very important, and it involves the hematopoietic system, or the blood system. And what hormone is that?
Is this the negative feedback one? Does that come?
No. It's something known as erythropoietin. Erythropoietin. You guys ever heard of that? Erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is a hormone that tells the body to manufacture red blood cells. RBCs, right? That actually comes from the kidney. Very important hormone, and this is why people that have renal failure, chronic renal failure, we often find that they are anemic if they cannot secrete erythropoietin, and we have to give them injections of erythropoietin every so often to stimulate their body to make red blood cells. Okay? There's some other hormones that come from the kidney as well. The other one that you want to be aware of, and we've talked about this one already, because this is a very important feedback system in blood pressure. We talked about this in great detail in cardiology. And what is that other hormone?
Angiotensin.
Not angiotensin.
Feedback. Renin.
Renin, right? Renin. Yeah.
Tip of my tongue.
Yeah. So they also secrete renin, right? Renin in response to
Pressure.
decreased pressure in the glomerulus, right? The GFR, the glomerular filtration rate decreases. We're going to talk about the renal system in gory detail probably next week. We'll go into that. All right. So there we go. All right, renin, and then renin, of course, does what? It converts angiotensinogen, which is running around in your blood. It causes angiotensinogen to be converted to angiotensin 1. And then angiotensin 1 goes to the lungs. As it circulates to the lungs, there's an enzyme in the pulmonary circulation called angiotensin converting enzyme, and that converts to angiotensin 2, which is the active form, right? And then angiotensin 2 has vasoconstrictive effects, and angiotensin 2 then acts upon the brain, the pituitary, to release something called aldosterone, right? Which is a hormone, right? And what is that hormone? Well, it causes us to hold on to water, right? And then when your glomerular filtration rate increases, renin secretion decreases, and you have your negative feedback mechanism. All right, you guys good with that? All right. So let's move on over to now the anterior pituitary gland, which is a pretty important one, and there are lots of hormones, and I'm going to talk about some selected ones that come from that. But I want you to see how the anterior pituitary gland is different from the posterior. So what do you notice in my little drawing here?
The axons don't come quite
The axons do not extend into the anterior pituitary, right? So the anterior pituitary gland has its own cells, hormone-secreting cells within it. You're like, oh, okay, so the anterior pituitary gland can run itself, right? Not exactly. Yeah. So there are neurons in the hypothalamus that secrete hormones into the portal vessels. So you have this venous network here, these what we call portal vessels of the hypothalamus. Okay, portal is just kind of like a venous network, and you can have portals in many other areas of the body, like the liver and so on. But so what happens is these neurons in the hypothalamus secrete hormones, okay, and then those hormones are known as trophic hormones, and then those hormones then get circulated down into the cells of the anterior pituitary gland and stimulate these cells to release or manufacture and secrete a variety of hormones. You guys okay with that? And I want to talk about some of the major players. The first major player that comes out of the anterior pituitary gland is something known as thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH. And what do you suppose TSH does?
Activates the thyroid.
It stimulates the thyroid gland. And what are the important hormones that come out of the thyroid gland?
Metabolic.
Yes. These are your thyroid hormones, or thyroxine, specifically the active forms T3 and T4. And these are important regulators of general metabolism, right? General body metabolism is regulated by thyroxine, okay? Which is ultimately regulated by thyroid stimulating hormone, or TSH hormone release, which is ultimately regulated by trophic hormone release from the hypothalamus, right? So it's turtles all the way down, huh? It's layer after layer after layer. Okay. The next hormone that comes out, the major hormone that comes out of the anterior pituitary gland, is something called growth hormone, or GH. And this primarily acts upon bones and muscles and causes them to grow, right? And this is important when it comes to development, particularly as kids are growing, right? And you have lots of cell division and lots of growth. This is very important. And we know that people that don't have enough growth hormone can become stunted in their growth. And this is something known as pituitary dwarfism, right? Or if you have too much growth hormone, your bones will grow big and long, you'll have overgrowth of muscles, your organs can grow and age, and it can be a bad thing, and that's something known as acromegaly. Right, where people, and these are like 8 feet, 7, 8 foot people, and
Is that Andre the Giant?
I think he did. I think he had acromegaly, yeah. I think there's a biblical story of the giant. And that may very well have referred to somebody with acromegaly. And one of the things that can happen with really severe cases is your eyes can kind of close off and you can become blind. And I don't know if anyone spends time reading the Bible or not, but in there they talk about the giant in the forest, and he's calling out to who ended up killing him. Does anyone happen to know? Colt might, yeah. He's gone, huh? David, right, is David and Goliath, the story of David and Goliath, right? And the Goliath is calling out to David, David, come and, I cannot see you, come and find me, come and fight me, probably, and because he couldn't see. And so there's speculation that may be very well what that story is kind of referencing, is somebody with acromegaly. I mean, who knows, but it is kind of interesting. Okay, good. The next hormone is something known as adrenal corticotrophic hormone, or ACTH, adrenal corticotrophic hormone. And this is a hormone that stimulates the adrenal gland. And where is the adrenal gland located?
Pancreas?
It's near the pancreas.
The top of the kidney.
Yeah, what does ad mean?
Yeah.
Ad means add.
Oh,
Put things together?
Yeah, on top of, right? I'm adding on to.
Right.
So add is on top of the renal. That's why it's called the adrenal. Yeah.
Remember that now.
Yeah. Add on top of that's literally why it's called the adrenal gland. Yeah. And the adrenal gland has two sections. It has an outer section known as the cortex, right? The adrenal cortex. Just like the cerebral cortex is the outer part of the upper part of the brain. And then an inner part called the medulla, the adrenal medulla. And so if you had to guess, adrenal trophic being stimulating, is going to stimulate the adrenal cortex. Isn't medical terminology amazing? Yeah. And that's going to cause the release of corticosteroids, right? Does that make sense? And there are two general flavors of corticosteroids, okay? There are glucocorticoids and mineral corticoids. What do you suppose glucocorticoids are going to do? Going to help regulate glucose, and the mineral corticoids are going to help regulate minerals, yeah. Specifically, glucocorticoids increase blood sugar, and mineral corticoids cause us to retain ions like sodium that help us retain water. You guys okay with that? And this is why when we administer a steroid to somebody with, let's say they're having an asthma attack or COPD, something like that, we administer a steroid, what are the side effects of steroids? Well, you can retain water and your blood sugar can get very high, right? So giving diabetic steroids, for example, can be very problematic. Right? Does that make sense?
So what is glucose steroid? Does it act on the liver?
Yes.
Or-
Yeah, well, liver, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, liver, and other, it basically activates gluconeogenesis.
Okay.
So there's some mechanisms via the pancreas as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
But just basically causes a increase in sugar production.
Increase in either, like glycogen breakdown via glucagon, which we're going to talk about here in just a little bit, yeah. So there's a lot of interconnectedness and interrelatedness going on here, and I've actually cut a lot of it out in order to try to simplify it for you guys, but yeah. So when you give somebody a steroid, not only does the steroid suppress the immune system, but it also it affects glucose and mineral water levels as well. And that makes sense, right? Because when are steroids released primarily? During a sympathetic or parasympathetic response?
It would be a sympathetic.
Yeah, right. If you're under severe stress, lots of steroids are released. Why? Because you need lots of glucose to fight off whatever it is you need to fight off. You need to hold on to water, right? Right, to keep your blood pressure up. And you need to shut down unnecessary systems. For example, the
Stomach and the GI tract.
right, and what do steroids do? What else do they do?
Immune system.
The immune system, yeah. You need to shut down the immune system, right? Yeah, and that makes sense, right? You're shutting down unnecessary things. And this may help explain why people that are under lots of chronic stress may be prone to certain problems because they have chronic immunosuppression, right? Due to that, yeah. So you can see there's a lot of interrelatedness kind of going on here. Okay, cool. So that's adrenal corticotrophic hormone, or ACTH. The next hormones, there are a set of hormones, and they essentially do the same things. These are luteinizing hormone, LH, and follicle stimulating hormone, FSH. LH and FSH go together. They stimulate the same organs, and they stimulate the gonads, the testes of the male, and the ovaries of the female. And these stimulate the testes and ovaries to release sex hormones. The primary sex hormones are progesterone, estrogen, and testosterone. Okay? And both men and women release all three of these hormones from their gonads. Obviously, men tend to release more testosterone than women, and women tend to release more estrogen and progesterone than men. But these are vital hormones in both the men and women. And we're not going to talk about what those hormones do in any detail here, because we actually have a reproductive class where we'll go more into what those hormones do. You guys okay with that, though? All right. And then finally, there is a hormone called prolactin, and pro means to make happen, right? So lact is lactation, so prolactin would act upon the breasts, specifically when we talk about lactation or milk production. Okay, you guys good with that so far? You good with kind of the major players that we see here? Excellent, all right. So now let's talk about some of the other players as well. All right. So the next one I want to talk about are they're sets of glands, they're small sets of glands that sit on the lateral aspect of the thyroid glands. So they're kind of found in conjunction with the thyroid, alongside of it. And what is a term that means to kind of alongside? Para, right? And you guys all know that, because what are you guys aiming to be? Alongside the doctor, which is medical, right? Physician. So para is alongside, right? With paramedic, alongside the medical doctor. Or the doctor, cool. So these are the parathyroid glands alongside the thyroid, but the parathyroid glands do not do what the thyroid does. They have a very different function. They secrete parathormones. One of the major types of parathormones is calcitonin, and what do you suppose that's important with?
Calcium regulation?
What's that?
Calcium regulation?
Yeah, more specifically calcium regulation. Yeah. Yeah, calcitonin. Actually, the growth hormone is really important when it comes to bones. Yeah. And occasionally, when people have thyroid surgery, when they remove the thyroid gland or thyroidectomy, occasionally the parathyroid glands can get inadvertently removed, which following the surgery, the patient may have a calcium crisis. They may be hypocalcemic. And what are the two classic signs that we look for to look for somebody who may be acutely hypocalcemic, life-threatening hypocalcemia? There are two signs that you want to be aware of.
Does it have to do with the heart?
Not so much the heart. This is hypocalcemia.
CHF?
Huh?
CHF.
I'm not aware of a CHF sign.
How would it be, would it be like, neurological deficit?
Okay, yeah, so you're going to have muscle hyperactivity, right? Because calcium is very important when it comes to muscle contractions. You're going to have very hyperactive muscles. Okay, the two signs are known as the Shavastic sign and the Trousseau sign. Okay, if you're not familiar with those, we talked about them in pathophysiology a little bit, but if you're not familiar with those, write them down and just kind of look them up, make sure you're okay. So the Shavastic sign is when you tap on the cheek, that will elicit spasms of the masseter and facial muscles, and you'll have spasms there. All right, I just think of cheek, Shavastic sign, cheek, right? The Trousseau sign is when you put a blood pressure cuff on somebody's arm and you begin to inflate it, they will have carpal spasms of their arm.
And what was that one called?
And that's the Trousseau sign. Yeah.
Shavastic?
Shavastic and Trousseau. Yeah, write them down and look them up. Yeah. And Shavastic is cheek, Trousseau is arm. Does that make sense? Yeah. Those are classic signs associated with life-threatening hypocalcemia. How would we treat that? Calcium, yeah, we give them calcium. How do we give calcium? Going back, pharmacology pop quiz. How do we give calcium? Do you give it like you were giving the lorazepam on that seizure patient yesterday? Is that how we give it? No? How do we give it?
Like over a drip
Yeah.
or an IV push?
Yeah,
Something like that?
Yeah, how do you give it?
Calcium?
Mm-hmm.
IV push?
I don't know. I'm asking you guys.
That's what I think it is, IV push. I can look it up.
Yeah, you can give it IV push, but it needs to be extraordinarily slow. Okay? You need to give it over 5 to 10 minutes. Okay?
So can you make it as a drip?
Yeah, you could.
Just so you don't have to sit there for...
You could, yeah. 5 to 10 minutes. Okay?
So it's only 2 grams of
Right? It's very slow. Very slow. Giving calcium rapidly is associated with some severe problems, and probably the most severe problem is something called stone heart syndrome, where you have kind of this over-contraction, you kind of have this contraction of the heart and it goes into tetany and then the heart just kind of contracts and stops. Yeah.
Yeah, it says do not exceed 2 milliliters a minute.
Yep. It's very slow. Hey, those books we made for you guys are paying off a little bit, huh? Yeah. And there are 2 flavors of calcium. There's calcium gluconate and calcium chloride. All right. Both are acceptable but one contains significantly more elemental calcium. And which one is it? Chloride, yes. Calcium chloride contains a lot more calcium than calcium gluconate. All right, so just kind of keep that in mind. Generally speaking, what's the typical dose for an adult patient?
5 to 10 ml.
Which is what? Because remember, chloride and gluconate are different.
If you give 5, it's 500 milligrams. If you give
Good.
10, it's 1,000 milligrams.
Good, so talking about calcium chloride specifically, right?
Chloride, yeah.
Yeah, you're talking chloride. Gluconate's a little different. The dose is a little different, but yeah, 500 to 1,000 milligrams, or 500 milligrams to a gram, slow IV is. And that would be the same dose for like life-threatening hyperkalemia as well.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, pretty much the same dose. Or I think the state of New Mexico, their big thing is black widow envenomation. Is that one of the major?
It's gone now.
Oh, it's gone now?
Yeah,
Okay.
it used to be on there. It's
Oh, okay. And which is funny because the evidence for that is paltry, to say the least. Okay, you guys good with that? So far, so good? Okay, cool. So now let's talk about this organ here. What is this thing? Hey, my art isn't too bad. Yeah, the pancreas there. Yeah, okay. Now the pancreas has lots of different functions. It secretes lots of enzymes, right? What are called so-called pancreatic enzymes, and these are proteases that help us digest, help us break down proteins into amino acids, right? When you eat that steak, right, breaks that steak down into its amino acids.
talking like bile.
Huh?
They call it bile.
Bile comes from the liver. Yeah, bile actually helps us digest fat.
Okay.
Bile is basically dish soap. Yeah, it's amphipathic. You guys ever heard that term, amphipathic? Yeah. So why do we use soap, dish soap?
Degreaser.
Yeah, because you have greasy dishes, right? And does grease, fatty, lipid, non-polar stuff dissolve in water? No. So what you do is you take something like soap, which is what we call an amphipathic molecule, where one side of it's charged is polar, so one side of it can dissolve in water, and then the other side is non-polar, so it can dissolve with the fat, right? So the fats attach to the soap, and then the soap attaches to the water, and now you can get your grease, your fats, and your lipids to dissolve in the water. That's called emulsifying. And so when you eat fatty food, okay, how do you get those fats in your body? How do you get that fat to dissolve in the digestive tract right? How does that happen?
Emulsifier.
Yeah, bile, which is kind of like dish soap, and it helps emulsify the fat, and then the fat can get absorbed in the digestive brush border. Cool, huh? But bile doesn't come from your pancreas.
It's just enzyme.
Yeah, enzymes come from, so proteases, lipases, which are ACEs and enzyme, break down
Fat.
lipids, and then you have amylases, which break down,
Amino acids.
nope, that's proteases.
Oh, proteases.
Yeah, break proteins into once you have amino acids, you don't really need to break things down any further. But amylase breaks down, we talked about this in pathophys a little bit. They break down carbohydrates, right? And there's another area of your body that secretes amylase, and where is it? Because fats and proteins don't start getting broken down until they enter your lower GI tract, right? But carbohydrates begin breaking down where?
The stomach? No.
No. Where do they begin breaking down?
Oh, in your mouth.
Yeah. Why? What's going on in your mouth?
Enzyme.
Salivary amylase, your salivary glands, right? And if you munch on a piece of bread, if you keep it in your mouth and you keep munching on it, what happens?
Dissolve.
Yeah, and it gets sweeter, right? tastes sweeter. And so why is that? Because those complex carbohydrates are being broken down into smaller chains and becoming more glucose-like, right? Glucose is just a monosaccharide, right? One sugar, right? And that's the kind of sugars that we need, pretty much are monosaccharides. The polysaccharides we can't use until those polymers are broken down into monosaccharides, right? Like glycogen. You guys know what glycogen is, right? Glycogen is lots and lots and lots of monosaccharides combined together. And then what happens? Glycogen breaks down into glucose. It releases glucose, monosaccharides. That ring any bells from Pathophys when we talked, right? When we talked about the molecules of life? Yeah, coming back to haunt you. All right, cool. Now, in addition to digestive enzymes, the pancreas also has a few million of these cell clusters known as islets of Langerhans. You have about 2-3 million of these. And these contain several different cell types. Here's just kind of an idealized drawing that I did of these cell types. And the 3 cells that you need to be aware of are the alpha cells, the beta cells, and the delta cells. And this is a classic question. A classic question. So the alpha cells secrete what hormone? Glucagon, good. The beta cells secrete insulin, okay? So glucagon comes from beta cells in the pancreas, pancreatic islets. Insulin comes from the beta cells of the pancreatic islets. You guys okay with that? Alpha glucagon, beta insulin. Alpha glucagon, beta insulin. You guys go with that? What does glucagon do?
Causes the breakdown of glycogen.
Good. So glucagon acts upon the liver, right?
Yeah.
I draw the liver here. All right. And it causes the liver to break glycogen down into glucose. What is the role of insulin?
Causes cell uptake of glucose.
Yeah, it is facilitated. It facilitates, right, the diffusion of glucose into the cell. You guys okay with that? All right. So, as your blood sugar increases, insulin release increases, right? As your blood sugar decreases, glucagon is released. And then there is a hormone that helps to regulate insulin and glucagon production. And that hormone comes from the delta cells of the pancreas, and that hormone is known as somatostatin, or somatostatin rather. And somatostatin has generally has more of an inhibitory effect on these systems here, okay? Inhibitory effect. Okay, you guys okay? Kind of makes sense, more or less? Okay, the last major hormone that I want to talk about, and again, there are many more, and yeah.
What's the feedback from somatostatin? Like, what tells it?
It's convoluted.
Okay.
Yeah. There's actually, we're going to get into this in the GI when I talk about the GI system. I believe that's next week, right? There are hormones and prohormones that your stomach has, and there's this whole layered mechanism going on in your GI tract, and somatostatin plays an important role. In fact, there are drugs that are derivatives of somatostatin, one's called sandostatin or octreotide, which we use to treat GI bleeds. And then somatostatin also interacts with growth hormone. There is a feedback with growth hormone and somatostatin, which is really complicated. And again, like I said, for this lecture, I've just kind of gutting a whole bunch of stuff out and going like with what the simplest picture is, even though as you can see, the simplest picture is still pretty complicated, and unfortunately, there's a little bit of hand waving that goes on, but yeah, there are some very complicated feedback, other mechanisms going on behind the scene. Good question, though, certainly. The last one I want to talk about is a gland near the heart. It's associated with the lymphatic system, and that is the thymus gland. And it releases thymosins, or thymosin hormones. And where are these hormones very important?
Like where they act?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, where do they act? What are they important for doing?
Blood pressure?
You'd think so, huh? These are important. They act upon lymphocytes. And how many general types of lymphocytes do you have?
What's that, white?
Lymphocytes.
Lymphocytes. Oh,
Yeah.
white blood cells.
Well, they're a type of white blood cell. But how many general categories of lymphocytes do you have? You've got two. You've got your B lymphocytes and your T lymphocytes. Oh, might the T have something to do with the thymus gland?
Yeah.
Yes, the thymosins are what cause the T lymphocytes to mature. Hence the term T lymphocytes. And if you had to guess, where do you think B lymphocytes mature? In the bone marrow. Yeah, that's why they're called B lymphocytes. Isn't that crazy?
So in one of my other courses, the thymus gland, that thing actually stops working as you age, is that right?
It slows down. It is most active in kids.
So 5 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Is that where that theory comes from, like expose kids to stuff because that's where their T helper cells go to mature?
It very well could be. Yeah, yeah. The hypothesis of, if you're like super clean and all that as a kid, you may go on to have more immune problems and things like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, I don't know how much credence there is there. I haven't really seen the evidence, but yeah. It's very active in kids. In fact, children that end up losing their thymus gland for whatever reason, or cancers and things like that, do go on to have lots of problems as adults. Lots of immune, very prone to infections and things like that. Now, if you remove the thymus gland as an adult, it doesn't seem to be as problematic because those whatever major things that had happened. Yeah. Yeah. Cool, huh? Incredible. I think it's incredible, all these connections we can make. Okay, so that's the foundation. Now I have a short, like I said, it's only 40 slides, so we'll be able to bust through it, because now what I want to do is I want to talk about disorders of all these hormones. And I'm going to focus on the life-threatening, most common disorders that you guys are going to run into. So there are going to be lots of disorders that I'm not going to be able to cover, like pituitary dwarfism and acromegaly and things like that. There's just not much we can do, and they're not as commonly encountered. So we'll go with the high-yield things.